Ooh, Mr. Darcy. Hello everyone, I'm Sarah from Everyday Starlet. Welcome to my channel. I make videos to inspire you to be the star of your own life. I'm continuing my Masculine Feminine Energies film breakdown series with Pride and Prejudice. If you're not familiar with what I mean by masculine feminine energies, I have a ton of videos on this content, but a brief summary. Masculine and feminine energies are energies that live within all of us. We all contain both energies, but we all have a core energy that's the one we're most ourselves in. That energy often links up with our gender. It doesn't have to, but it very often does. We can be in wounded or healed versions of either of these energies, and each of these energies contains archetypes. We all contain all of the archetypes within us, so we can tap into whenever we need to. I have a lot of videos about the masculine and the feminine archetypes if you want to learn more. And in order to have sexual polarity in a relationship, you need one partner to be in the masculine and one partner to be in the feminine. These opposite energies attract sexually and same energies repel sexually. So today we're talking about Pride and Prejudice. Now this was a highly requested film. It's originally a novel and it's been made into stage plays. It's been made into a TV miniseries. It was made into a movie. And I had so many people requesting Pride and Prejudice, but unfortunately no one was telling me which version it was they wanted. So when I actually went to sit down and do this breakdown, I actually put it up on social media, on Instagram and TikTok, which version of Pride and Prejudice you guys wanted me to break down. And the 1995 BBC miniseries version was the most requested. Not surprising because Colin Firth is kind of considered the ultimate Mr. Darcy. I did get some requests for the 2005 film version with Keira Knightley. I actually had not seen either version. I'd actually only seen I think I saw the stage play of this years ago in a local theater group because a friend of mine was in it. So if after this breakdown you guys really want me to break down the 2005 version, let me know. I'm open to it. But I haven't seen it, so I don't know how it differs from the 1995 BBC miniseries version. It was interesting too that overwhelmingly I got people that wanted me to do the 1995 miniseries version, but it was primarily people who were kind of more in my age range, and I got more requests for the 2005 version from people who are a little bit younger. So I think that kind of just goes to show that generationally we tend to be attracted more to the media, movies, things we experience kind of from our own time period. I also do know that the more modern day movie Bridget Jones's Diary, which has also been highly requested, is actually a modern spin-off of Pride and Prejudice. I am going to be doing that as a film breakdown. It's on my list. I will be doing that. Since I know that Colin Firth plays the Mr. Darcy character essentially in Bridget Jones's Diary, I kind of thought it made sense to do the Colin Firth version of Pride and Prejudice so I'd be able to compare the two. So the 1995 BBC version of Pride and Prejudice was actually a 6-part miniseries. I won't be able to dive into all the characters, and I really want to focus on Lizzy and Mr. Darcy because they're really the central story. And let's face it, their relationship is really what draws people to the story. So let's start with Elizabeth Bennet, better known as Lizzy. I really love Lizzy. I love her character, and I think one of the reasons why I love her character so much is because she is such a great example of the type of feminine energy that I talk about on my channel. And if you have not seen this movie, I highly recommend that you watch it to really get a feel of Lizzy, because she's so feminine in a sense. But one of the reasons why I love her feminine energy specifically is because it's not necessarily what we see today as being the narrative of what being feminine actually is. I see feminine energy as having so many flavors and different archetypes and having so much character and nuance, and it's not something that you can fit into one little structured box. And Lizzy is such a perfect example of that. It's interesting how in this movie, they always kind of talk about Jane, her older sister, as being the pretty one, and all the men seem to instantly fall in love with Jane because she's the pretty one. Some of this might be casting, but in reality, Jane and Lizzy are both absolutely beautiful women. So the fact that they kept referring to Jane as being the pretty one, it seemed a little odd at first, but if you really think about it, Jane is what we traditionally think of as feminine. She's soft, she's sweet, she's very agreeable. They even joke at the end of the movie, actually, when she gets engaged, her father makes a comment about how he's sure that she's so agreeable that the staff will completely take advantage of her and her fiance because they're just such nice people. And there's nothing wrong with that. Jane is the epitome of light feminine energy. And there's nothing wrong with being a Jane, so to speak. Jane and her light, beautiful feminine energy is going to be very appealing to a lot of people. And the interesting thing is that Jane and Lizzy are not necessarily one is not really better looking than the other. They're both beautiful women. However, the more soft, light feminine is going to appeal to more people because it is more traditional, it's more agreeable. It tends to be something that for a man is going to appear safer. It's going to be somewhat easier. And I'm not saying that Jane is easy, so to speak, but she is more agreeable. She's somebody who's going to appeal to more people because she is softer, lighter. In this particular case, Jane does find someone who truly loves her and does appear like he is a lovely man who's going to take care of her. So she's not going to put herself in a position where she's going to be unsafe. That said, a Jane in everyday life where everybody sees her as the pretty one because she's just got her light feminine and she's soft and more agreeable, she does leave herself open to men who are just going to use her and take advantage of her for her niceness, for her sweetness, for her lightness. In this particular case, that doesn't happen. However, in real life, if you are a woman who only embraces that light feminine of you, which is a beautiful thing, and I'm not at all telling anyone to not embrace that light feminine of her, but if you only embrace that and you don't tap into any of your dark feminine, you are more likely to get taken advantage of. You're more likely to possibly end up with a partner who may be more controlling or may be even potentially abusive, which is why most women really need both. It's interesting how Jane is really more of the sister who is more traditional idea of what a woman is supposed to be, is supposed to act like, what a feminine woman is kind of stereotypically. Now, I believe Lydia is the youngest sister, and she's really like the wild one. She's kind of got a little bit of a reputation to her. The soldiers in town all really like her because she's a flirt. She's a little bit more of that like modern day women's liberation. Women can just be free and don't have any consequences and don't have any ability to control their own actions and are just absolutely like chaotic and free and wild. Now granted, in this movie she's like 15, so she is still very young. However, in that time period, 15-year-old girls were getting married, which is just a whole other topic in itself. But she is more the type that in our modern day society would be a little bit more celebrated, whereas somebody like Lizzy, who's actually this kind of combination of her dark and her light feminine, is this kind of great balance, and that's why she ends up enticing the man of the movie, Mr. Darcy, which we'll get to in a minute. Lizzy really is the embodiment of so many feminine archetypes. Lizzy does still have a lot of her playful maiden in her. She also has a lot of mothering energy within her, partly probably because she is the second oldest sister in a large family, so she kind of naturally is used to taking care of younger siblings. But she has a really beautiful motherly connection with Mr. Darcy's younger sister, who he very much takes on as a daughter to him. He cares for her and protects her like she's his own. And the scenes with Lizzy and Mr. Darcy's sister is just, they're really beautiful. Lizzy actually is playing the piano at one point, and you can tell that Mr. Darcy's sister, Georgiana, is a little self-conscious. She's a little unsure of herself, and the way that Lizzy talks to her is so beautiful. Like, you know, Georgiana's kind of like, oh, you know, my brother bought me this piano, I don't deserve it. And, you know, Lizzy's like, no, I'm sure you do. I mean, he thinks you do. And, you know, she's really self-conscious about playing the piano, and Lizzy really kind of like gets her to open up, gets her to step out of her comfort zone. Like, she got a very motherly way with her. And Lizzy knows there's actually a pretty traumatic history between Georgiana and Mr. Wickham. And so when Mr. Wickham's name comes up and Georgiana gets really uncomfortable, Lizzy like jumps to her side and is basically there with her to kind of distract her in a way, but also to comfort her and let her know she's okay. And not everybody knows what's actually gone on behind the scenes, but Mr. Darcy knows. And it's a really beautiful moment where Mr. Darcy looks on Lizzy and realizes that Lizzy has this beautiful, nurturing mother instinct within her, which is one of the reasons why he's drawn to her. Lizzy also has a beautiful lover energy. For one thing, she makes a pact that she will not marry a man she's not in love with, which in that time period was not common. In that time period, women really had to marry for money, property, status. They had to marry for their own safety and security. The idea of marrying for love was not a given in those times. And she really wanted to be in love. She wanted to feel love. She's also, you know, she's very much into sensuality. She's very much into you know, the beauty of things, music, dancing. Like, she has a lot of lover energy within her, which is very intoxicating. There's actually a moment where Mr. Darcy is looking out the window at Lizzy and she's playing with the dog, like in the grass, and you know, it's like that playfulness that's partly her maiden, that's also partly her lover energy. I'll get to Mr. Darcy in a minute, but he is so intoxicated by that free spirit, that playfulness. It's also tapped into her wild woman. In that time period, you know, Lizzy would just go like trekking through the mud and she would get her dress dirty and, you know, her feet would be dirty and things like that. Like, she didn't necessarily follow the protocol of always being the clean, polished, good girl. That's very much her wild woman. Her wild woman is also her very outspoken nature. Lizzy's outspokenness is one of her best qualities. I'm gonna get to that part in a minute with one of my favorite lines from the whole movie when I get into Mr. Darcy. But her outspoken nature is absolutely a big part of what makes Lizzy such a memorable character. The wise woman, it's very much said that Lizzy really is the smartest one in the family. Like, she's very intelligent. I don't really know exactly what her education is, so to speak, but back in those days, a woman being intelligent wasn't necessarily something that was valued, and she is a very smart woman. And I would say her queen and her huntress are actually somewhat tied together, also with her wild woman and her outspoken nature. She's not necessarily like a fighter, like aggressive, but Lizzy knows and owns her worth. And in that time period, again, when women really needed to marry for safety and security, and she doesn't come from a family who has a lot of wealth, who has a lot to offer, the fact that she holds her worth and is proposed to several times and turns it down, which again, in that time period, not common for a woman to do. You know, Mr. Collins, who is seen as a man who is going to rescue her whole family, proposes to her really just because he wants a wife and doesn't really actually care about Lizzy at all. He thinks she's gonna be just an agreeable wife so he can have the status of having a wife, and she turns him down, which massively offends him because he's obviously somebody whose ego can't handle rejection. And to be honest with you, his ego could not handle Lizzy's strength at all. It would not have worked. But also when Mr. Darcy proposes to Lizzy the first time, somebody like Mr. Darcy, who is wildly successful, wealthy, comes from a good family, is like the ultimate prize for any of these women. And the fact that he proposes to Lizzy but doesn't do it in a way that actually makes Lizzy feel inspired to love him, and doesn't do it in a way that she feels like honors her own worth, she's willing to turn him down. She's willing to walk away. She was willing to give up pretty much one of the most coveted lives and the most coveted positions of being the wife of this successful man, you know, that most women in that time period would have killed for, because she just owned her worth enough to know that giving into a man that wasn't actually going to show up in the way that she needed him to show up was not, it just wasn't in the cards for her. She just was not going to let him get away with talking to her in a certain way. And you got to give it up to Lizzy for really knowing and owning her worth and being able to be vocal about her wants and needs, her yeses and nos. In that time period, a woman being okay with setting boundaries and saying no was not a common thing. I mean, this is really revolutionary for its time period. And that's why I think somebody like Lizzy is such a beautiful example of the type of feminine energy that I talk about. Because I don't want women to get into this idea that being feminine means that you have to be a sweet, agreeable, you know, sort of a passive, submissive woman. There's aspects to that that are very feminine, but that's not all that feminine energy is. And in our society, we tend to put being feminine into that little box of like, oh, she needs to be this like submissive, agreeable woman. When in reality, connecting to your feminine energy can absolutely be about the beautiful light feminine. It can be nurturing, playful, fun, full of joy, full of sensuality, full of pleasure. But it can also be owning your worth, speaking your truth, doing things that are a little unconventional, getting your hands and feet a little dirty. Many women carry like a witch wound of doing anything that might be not the norm or not the standard traditional idea of feminine, you know, getting dirty in the mud or doing something that might not fit in with society. Many women have a deep fear that we'll be burned as witches if we, you know, we try natural medicines, or we spend too much time in nature or in the dirt, or we do things that are a little unconventional. I want women to feel empowered to do that. I want women to be able to connect to their soft, light feminine, because I think that's beautiful, and I think we all could use more soft, light feminine in our lives. But I also want women to be able to connect to that dark feminine energy, that dark feminine energy that knows that you will slash a man's ego if you need to, the dark feminine energy that knows how to own her worth, that knows how to speak her truth, that's willing to step outside the box of what we as society have told women that they have to be, or step outside the box of like what is considered feminine, or even step outside the box of what is considered feminist or you know, liberated as a woman. Like, step outside what you're being told to be and really connect to that, like, your inner witch, your inner wild woman, the inner part of you that wants to do things that might be a little unconventional, your inner creative. And I think that those things that are more of your dark feminine are beautiful. And one of the things I love about Lizzy and her representation of the dark versus the light feminine is, for one thing, is her character is a great example of both. She's very warm, loving, nurturing. She's polite. I mean, she's got so many beautiful, soft, light, feminine qualities. She also has this dark feminine to her, but her dark feminine is still, it's pretty polite, you know what I mean? Like, she doesn't necessarily have to be physically destroying things. She doesn't get violent. She doesn't get angry or aggressive or full of rage, so to speak. Her dark feminine is actually very grounded. It might be a sign of the times in the way it was written, but also it's an example of the fact that the dark feminine really will test the masculine's ego. That's the point. I have a whole video about the dark feminine. I love talking about the dark feminine, where the dark feminine will only accept the masculine and his true soul level self. Like, she will not accept the masculine's ego at all. And that's what Lizzy does. But not accepting the masculine's ego does not have to be this rageful, like, in your face, just, you know, angry, aggressive, crazy kind of thing. Sometimes that might be called for, but it's not always the case, right? Sometimes slashing the masculine's ego is literally saying something to him like, you know, had you behaved in a more gentlemanly manner. Like, that could be enough to just say, you know what? No, if you're not going to come to me like a masculine man, like a grown adult masculine man in full alignment, and you're going to come to me with ego, done. I'm not going to deal with you. You don't have to yell. You don't have to scream. You don't have to go crazy. You can just say, I'm done with you. That's that. And the dark feminine is going to show up in so many different ways, but I just think that Lizzy's version of the dark feminine is so beautiful because it's there. Like, she definitely has a lot of dark feminine energy in her. It can exist in this very sort of sweet, light feminine woman. It's not necessarily like an all or nothing kind of thing, and I love the nuance of this character. One of the reasons why I highly recommend that if you have not seen this movie or this miniseries, check it out, because Lizzy's character I just found to be just really a beautiful example of the dark and the light feminine, and how dark feminine energy can really show up in such a beautiful feminine way. I mean, the aesthetics of this are absolutely stunning. I mean, it's interesting how this is 1995, and obviously it takes place in a totally different time period than that, but the trends and the sort of aesthetic of it, this kind of like English countryside kind of aesthetic, it's actually really trendy nowadays. So kind of goes to show that a lot of these things, just the trends, the aesthetics, some of them are just timeless. But also, you can be a sweet woman living in an English countryside, and you can also slash a man's ego anytime you need to, and all in the name of your feminine energy. So Mr. Darcy is such a masculine character. He's masculine at his core, you can tell. Like, everything that he does is driven by his masculine energy. Unfortunately, he's kind of an example of what it is when you're only connected to your masculine energy and you haven't actually tapped into any of your feminine energy. It's not that Mr. Darcy doesn't have a heart, he does, but he has put so many walls and guards up around his heart. It's almost like he has just tuned out any concept of love, connection, empathy, and he is just going through life with structure, purpose. He has a a role, a status in life, and this is what he's doing, and he is just focused on that. And he's known to be a provider for his family. He is very protective, particularly of his sister. He's even protective of his friends and makes some somewhat bad decisions in advising people and in making certain moves, but doesn't really want to accept them because he's got this pride, which is his ego. Now, one of the things I like about Mr. Darcy is that he definitely has an ego struggle that he's going through. Oftentimes when the masculine gets so caught up in being masculine, he can't tap into any of his inner feminine energy of like having a heart, empathy, things like that. The ego can come in and overpower him. His version of ego is not necessarily what we see in more modern times with men. His version of ego is a little bit more, it's his stubbornness, his pride. It's not so much that Mr. Darcy wants to hurt other people to make himself feel superior, which is more the stereotypical way that we see men kind of in their masculine ego nowadays. It doesn't really seem like he's intending to be vindictive most of the time. He actually has a really strong drive to protect. Unfortunately, he has such a wall up because he has been hurt. You can tell he's been hurt. He's been betrayed by a man who was kind of a bit like a brother to him, Wickham, which I won't really dive into too much. Wickham is like your stereotypical playboy character, is just out to use people for what they can get. I mean, he's truly the masculine ego that we think of today. It's just like, I'm going to use people for what I can get, toss them aside, I'm going to say anything I want to get anything I want. Like, he's more that character. Wickham actually had this elaborate plan to get Mr. Darcy's money and ran off with Mr. Darcy's younger sister when she was 15, kind of manipulated her into running away, and Sir Darcy had to go and protect his sister. He's a real drive to protect, especially of his sister. He really does have a fatherly kind of relationship with his sister of wanting to protect her, which shows that he does care and he does have a heart. So it's not that Mr. Darcy necessarily is in the masculine ego, or really, I wouldn't necessarily say his masculine is, it's not wounded in the way of like a Wickham, whereas Wickham has more of like the wounded masculine of abusing people and the wounded feminine of somewhat being self-destructive or being addicted to pleasures and things like that. Wickham is kind of that stereotypical kind of like narcissist sociopath, like does anything to get what he needs to kind of thing. So you've got like wounded masculine and wounded feminine in a character like that. Mr. Darcy's masculine wounding is a bit more subtle, and it's not so much that he ever goes specifically out to hurt people. He just makes decisions sometimes that are more from his head and what he believes is right, without actually taking everything into consideration and without actually taking people's feelings into consideration. Can come across very cruel. I'm not saying that that's a good thing necessarily, but that is something that very often masculine men can fall into. So I'm not making excuses for the masculine ego. However, when you have a man who is so masculine at his core, but then he's been hurt, so he still managed to stay grounded in his masculine, like Mr. Darcy. He still knows his role, he knows his place, he knows his status, he knows that protecting and providing is important, he knows how to take care of his family. He has all these amazing qualities, but yet he's still been hurt and he's become very distrustful of people. And he becomes so singularly focused, which is a quality of the masculine, and he totally disregards feelings, emotions, things like that. I don't necessarily want to call it wounded masculine, because wounded masculine tends to be much more hurtful and abusive, but it dances that line on wounded masculine, right? Mr. Darcy does end up doing things that are somewhat hurtful. I don't think it's ever intended to be, though. I don't think he's somebody who really wants to hurt people. Unfortunately, his version of trying to protect people and trying to protect himself can come across that way. He essentially insults Lizzy very early on after they've met, and he doesn't know that Lizzy has heard him insult her. So he doesn't really know the source of Lizzy's kind of dislike of him. The reality is he does like her. He's very attracted to her and he's very drawn to her. Unfortunately, he knows that because of their family situations, that them being together is probably not like the smart thing to do. So he's trying to convince himself that Lizzy is not what he wants, because he fears it's not the practical thing to do. The masculine's going to be very focused on practicality, what makes sense, what should he do. And when he doesn't let any of his feelings get involved and he shuts those down, sometimes his decisions all coming from his masculine mind are not always going to be the best decisions. decisions. And in that situation, he didn't really intend to hurt Lizzy specifically. He was trying to protect himself. Now, I'm not using this as a justification for men insulting women or being cruel or anything like that. This isn't about that. This is Mr. Darcy's stuff that he needs to work through. Which he kind of does throughout the series, is he has to work through this stuff to deal with his own feelings, to deal with how he feels about Lizzy, and they seem to keep running into each other. And Mr. Darcy is finding himself more and more attracted to Lizzy. Now, Lizzy is blocked off from Mr. Darcy because he has presented himself in a way that is very unappealing. He's insulted her, so obviously she's not going to feel safe and comfortable with him because she feels like he doesn't think that she's good enough for him, which to a certain extent in the beginning he doesn't. She then finds out that Mr. Darcy is trying to keep her sister away from the man that she loves, and Lizzy doesn't like that Mr. Darcy is making decisions about their love life that in reality Mr. Darcy admits later was a bad decision. Part of that too was because he saw his friend falling for somebody and didn't want his friend to open his heart and fall in love, because Mr. Darcy was afraid of opening up his heart and falling in love. He did not want his friend to get hurt. He didn't want himself to get hurt. He was projecting a lot of his feelings, his conflicted feelings that he wasn't able to accept about Lizzy onto his friend and how his friend felt about Jane. He was making some bad decisions. So then Lizzy gets information about Wickham and that Mr. Darcy has treated Wickham very badly, but Lizzy doesn't know the whole story. But because she's already got a lot of assumptions about how Mr. Darcy is showing up, she's assuming that the stories about Wickham are true. She's kind of fallen for Wickham's charms, which a lot of people do. That brings up a lot of stuff for Mr. Darcy. Again, there's a whole lot of like misunderstandings and you know, all this kind of stuff that happens like throughout the entire series, and I'm not going to dive into all these different storylines. But what I'm getting at is Lizzy in the beginning she's got a guard up because she's distrustful of Mr. Darcy. She's making a lot of assumptions. He hasn't presented himself in really, you know, as she would put it, a gentlemanly manner, and all of these things that are happening are kind of combining on top of each other to make her distrust him even more. And that's putting her wall up. Mr. Darcy has a serious wall up because he doesn't really feel comfortable with opening up his heart. That's very common with a very masculine man. They very often are not comfortable in their feelings. They're not comfortable in their emotions. They're not comfortable opening their heart. But one thing about the masculine loves a challenge. The masculine thrives in challenge. The feminine thrives in safety. The thing about the Mr. Darcy and Lizzy relationship is because Mr. Darcy is so masculine, Lizzy, who is very much connected to her dark feminine, as I said earlier, she's a challenge for him. She's not making his life easy. She's not the soft, agreeable woman that Jane is. And Mr. Darcy's one of the few people that isn't intoxicated by Jane. Because at the end of the day, he likes the challenge. He likes the fact that Lizzy is kind of forcing him in a way. I mean, she's not forcing him in a sense, but her existence, like her being her, is kind of forcing him to have to connect to parts of himself that he wasn't comfortable connecting with. He's fighting it, but he's also kind of enjoying it. That's one of the beautiful parts to their relationship. But the problem is that Lizzy, because she's such a feminine being at her core, she thrives in safety. And Mr. Darcy has not presented himself as a safe person. So that's where you get the conflict, is that Mr. Darcy is starting to fall for Lizzy because Lizzy is the challenge that is inspiring him to be better and to connect with the parts of himself that have been closed down. But Mr. Darcy has the challenge of needing to present himself as a safe partner for Lizzy in order for her to actually be able to fully open up to him, and that's where they're in that battle. There's so many beautiful moments of polarity. Masculine is the one who witnesses, he's the one who sees, and the feminine is the one who is seen. There's so many beautiful moments in this movie, like when Mr. Darcy's getting out of the tub, because Colin Firth getting out of the tub is a pretty beautiful moment in its own right, but he's looking out the window, like I said earlier, he's looking out the window at Lizzy. She's like playing with the dog in the grass, and like that's just, it's literally like the feminine in nature and animals and her being playful, and him and his seriousness is so drawn to that. Another scene too where they're all kind of in this parlor, so to speak, and Mr. Darcy is sitting there and watching Lizzy play the piano and singing. Her beauty, her radiance, and he is like witnessing her, and that's actually like when the feminine is in her pure radiant creativity and her sensuality, like that is so intoxicating to a masculine man. Mr. Darcy, being so masculine, cannot resist the feminine polarity of someone like Lizzy. Now, the first time Mr. Darcy proposes is quite interesting. Like, I don't know, there's something about this scene where the two of them are having this like battle of the egos, but because it's in this kind of like old world British speech, it's like this like battle of the egos, but it's like so elegant. It's just, it's really kind of entertaining to watch. So Mr. Darcy's proposal to Lizzy is essentially like, well, this is against my better judgment. I don't think this is a good idea. You are way beneath my station. I should be with somebody way better than you, but I love you and I can't help it, so marry me. Like, that's essentially the gist of what he's saying. And Lizzy's just like, no, I deserve better than this. I deserve somebody who will treat me better, you know, and she'll start listing all the things that he's done. And of course, his ego gets hurt, so he lashes back with, you know, all the reasons why, you know, she isn't the woman that he should be with. And so she snaps back basically with like, well, you know, if you had been, you know, acting in a more gentlemanly manner, which later on in the series, Mr. Darcy points out that that was a big moment that Lizzy called him out and he actually was inspired to step up. That's a really important aspect to the masculine feminine dynamics. Again, a masculine man is going to thrive in challenge. A truly masculine man is not going to want a woman who just lets him get away with anything, because he's not going to become the best version of himself that way. In order for a masculine man to be the best version of himself, he needs to be with a partner who basically is like, I won't tolerate anything less than your most aligned masculine. I won't tolerate anything less than what I know you are capable of bringing. That's what inspires him to be better. Now, the masculine ego, not gonna like it. A masculine man who's living in his ego, not gonna be able to handle a woman who calls him out, is not gonna be able to handle a woman who is willing to speak her truth, to speak her mind. He's not gonna be able to handle that. A truly aligned masculine man, even if he doesn't necessarily like when she calls him out on things, is going to appreciate that his partner is holding him to a higher standard, because he's gonna thrive in that challenge of needing to reach the point that, like, it's not that she's saying she wants him to be somebody else. That's a different thing. She's saying that she needs him. She knows this is where he's capable of. If he's here, he needs to get there. Like, he needs to reach his full potential, and she won't tolerate anything less. That's how you inspire a man to be great. That's what Lizzy is doing to Mr. Darcy. Basically, she calls him out like, hey, if you're not gonna act like a gentleman, you're not gonna get what you want from me. And he ends up really appreciating that she held him to that standard. There's also, this is probably my favorite line in this entire series, when Lizzy and her aunt and uncle are visiting the grounds that Mr. Darcy's family owns, and they don't expect to see him, and they run into him there, and he's asking her like what she thinks of the grounds. They're nice. She's embarrassed because she has run into him and things are still kind of awkward between them, and so she's really uncomfortable. And he basically, you know, is asking for her opinion. And he says, well, you know, your good opinion is rarely bestowed. Basically, what the gist of what he's saying is, you know, you give your opinions freely and you don't always give praise. So if you do like what you see, it means more. And that's a big misconception, is when you as a man need to find a woman who is agreeable with everything, goes along with everything, is like, yes, this is great, just agrees with you with everything, eventually her agreeableness is not going to mean anything to you. Whereas when you have a woman who you know, not necessarily is hard on you for no reason at all, you have a woman who you know her standards are at a certain level where she's not just gonna praise you for any little thing. When you do get her praise, when you do get her approval of something, you know it's earned. The masculine wants to be challenged. He wants to be able to earn things. Like, that's the masculine drive. The feminine wants to feel safe to open, but the masculine wants to be thriving in challenge. So when you have a woman who just goes along with everything that you do and everything that you say, and it's just like, yeah, everything's great, you're wonderful, blah, 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 eventually that constant approval is not going to mean anything to him. She's just going to agree with everything. So he's either going to lower his standards, or he may actually go off and find another woman who is a little bit tougher to impress. If a woman is blindly impressed by everything that a man does, eventually that approval, that praise, he's gonna get tired of it. Like, it's not gonna mean as much. Whereas when you have a woman who you know has a higher standard, a man knows when he reaches that standard and she is approving, when she is open to him, it means something. And in the same way that one of the reasons I believe that men are so leery of women with, say, like a high body count, or women who have been with a lot of guys or something like that, is that if a woman is too easy to get in bed, then if he gets her in bed, he hasn't really achieved anything. Whereas if a woman is difficult to get in bed, like if her standards are so high that she's not willing to just go to bed with just anybody, if a man does get her in bed, that's more impressive, right? Like he's achieved something. Men like a challenge. They're the hunters. I don't love this analogy, but this is an analogy that I read, where I actually read this before. It was in a dating book a while ago, that like if a man goes out and he hunts, if he gets an animal easily, it's like, okay, whatever. Whereas if a man has really had to put a lot of effort and a lot of work in to hunt a specific animal, like that's the head he's gonna mount on his wall. I don't love that analogy because I don't love the idea of, like, I suppose it's like a trophy wife, like you mount it on the wall or something like that. I don't know. I don't necessarily love that analogy, so to speak, but there is something to the idea that if a woman is more of a challenge to get, that a masculine man is going to be inspired to work harder in order to impress her. And in that case, he's actually achieved something when he does impress her. It's just one line in this entire miniseries, but I just absolutely adore this one little interaction where it's like, again, Mr. Darcy's admitting, like, Lizzy's hard to please. She's not easy to please. So when he does please her, he knows he's done something impressive. He knows something is worth it. And that is a masculine man right there. And in this point, they've kind of shifted. They've shifted a little bit into Lizzy's starting to open up to him. He's acknowledging that he likes these things about her. He likes she speaks her mind. And this is where things are starting to shift between the two of them. Now, Mr. Darcy secretly helps out Lizzy's family. Lizzy finds out about it. She, thanks him, and the two of them are really starting to open up. And it's interesting how sort of in the final scenes of this mini series, Mr. Darcy essentially says to Lizzy that his feelings have not changed. He doesn't know if her feelings have changed or not, but his feelings have not changed. Lizzy basically says, oh, she feels so differently now. That's very common in masculine feminine dynamics. So the masculine, he still loves her, but he has opened up. So I don't think it's necessarily that he hasn't changed at all. He's changed as a person and he still views her the same way. He's just opening up to her. So it's not necessarily that he's changed a lot in the course of this story, but his feelings for her, like, he's still as drawn to her now as he was before. The masculine will tend to be kind of, you think about the masculine, it's kind of like a straight line. He's like a straight road. He's in one direction. He's singularly focused. The feminine can change her feelings and emotions literally in an instant. Like, she's always feeling something different because the feminine is more responsive. The fact that Lizzy is like, oh my God, my feelings have changed. Oh, everything's changing so much. Everything's different. The fact that Lizzy is so feminine at her core, her feelings are changing moment to moment. As she's learning more about Mr. Darcy, as she is realizing what a stable masculine man he is, as she's realizing what a loving person he actually is, what he's been willing to do to help out her family, who he actually is as a person, how much he cares about his sister, how honorable he is, how he does end up getting to a point where he's admitted to, being wrong, which shows that he is actually, and Mr. Darcy does go through an ego death as this series goes along. It's not a dramatic ego death. Like I talked about the ego death in Jerry Maguire, which is a very dramatic one. It's not a dramatic ego death, but he does learn to, as the series goes on, he learns to let go of that ego, which is a really important part of connecting to, either you're masculine or you're feminine, because the ego will get in the way of your natural core energy in anybody. Particularly in this case, Mr. Darcy's ego has really been the block of him actually getting the life that he truly wants. And the fact that he's now shifted from living from his ego into living from his aligned masculine, it's really opened up Lizzy. And it's really gotten her to see him more for who he truly is and not for the wall he has put up to protect himself from potentially being hurt. This is actually, I think, a really significant idea because there are a lot of men that get this message. And I don't know where this message even came from because it's so not true. But it's this idea that women decide within the first 15 seconds of meeting a guy whether they're going to sleep with them or not. That's not true. Very often, and this goes for men or women, but very often if you have an initial like this is the one, this person's the one, it's usually a trauma bond. But the masculine will be drawn to the feminine quickly. Like the polarity is going to be quick. However, the feminine will often take a while to truly love. She can have an instant sexual attraction to somebody the same way that the masculine can, but the feminine is gonna need a while to open her heart in order to love someone. That's something that happens gradually because the feminine is going to need to constantly be feeling into, is this man safe for me to open? Is this man safe for me to open? And even if she does love a man really early on, if he consistently shows up as a safe, grounded partner so she can consistently keep opening and opening and opening, the more open the feminine is, the more open her heart is going to be, the more she's going to love her partner. This is a really great example of the fact that Lizzy was shut down because she didn't perceive Mr. Darcy as being a safe partner at the time, because he wasn't really presenting himself that way in the beginning. But as he gradually started to show up and prove himself, Lizzy eventually started to open her heart and see him for the man he truly was and not for the wall that he was putting up of himself. Generally speaking, like if your goal is to just get a woman into bed as quickly as possible, which I know some guys it is, but that's not what my content is designed for, then that instant attraction, that instant chemistry is probably the most important thing, because it's usually a sign of a trauma bond, and that probably means that the person is probably going to compromise their own values and morals and things like that, because they're going to be blind to and trauma bonds are a whole other topic I'm not going to get into. But if you're looking for a deep connection, like you want a deep intimate connection with sexual polarity and masculine feminine dynamics, then the masculine is going to need to show up in his full integrity consistently, and the feminine will then gradually open up to him. That's how you get love. Now, the actual sexual polarity can be instant, but that really isn't the love part. The love part is, for the feminine, how safe do I feel with the masculine in order for me to open? And the more that the feminine can open, the more she's going to feel love for him. Now that can take time, and very often the masculine likes to achieve things. He likes to, you know, get from point A to point B. The feminine is somebody who more enjoys the journey. The masculine can sometimes feel frustrated, where it's like, well, why haven't we gotten to this point yet where I want to be? And the feminine really kind of needs more time to soften and open. Actually, I think if we had that shift in the dating dynamic, where we actually realize, like women realize, that it's going to take a little bit of time for you to realize if a man is actually able to show up, if he's showing up consistently, if he's trustable, and if men can understand that women need to move things slower in order for them to really be able to trust you, to fully open to you. If we accepted this part about men and women in relationships and actually took time during the dating phase to get to know each other, as opposed to showing up, going on a date, and you know, you hook up and then you're emotionally connected. In some cases you end up with a kid too soon, you end up moving in together, like, and people haven't actually taken the time to get to know each other. Because these kind of things, like polarity, yes, sexual polarity can happen instantly, but the love and the relationships, that stuff needs to happen over time. So, you know, we're so in a rush to like just, you know, get things done, but it's like some of these things need to happen over time. It's interesting too when Lizzy tells Jane that she's engaged to Mr. Darcy, and Jane's like, but I thought you hated him, like what's the deal here? It's interesting how Jane is like, honestly, tell me how long you've known that you loved Mr. Darcy. And she's like, well, it happened so slowly, I don't even know how it happened. That's very common with the feminine, where when she's on that journey, when she's really, you know, connecting to a masculine partner, she often doesn't necessarily think to a specific moment. It tends to be how he's consistently showing up. Now, she does kind of make a little bit of a joke about like, well, it's kind of when I saw his grounds at Pemberley, like when I saw how much his, you know, he was worth, like that's when I fell for him. But in reality, like Lizzy has shown no signs of being a gold digger throughout the whole movie. That's obviously her just being cheeky, but it's that moment when she ran into him on those grounds, when he made the comment about how, you know, essentially like her compliments don't come easily, so like her good word, it means more to him. Like, I don't know, I think that's the moment. Like, she can say like, oh, well, it was when I saw his land and I saw how much land he had. Like, I think she can say that kind of kiddingly, but in reality, because she's always been so hell-bent on, like, she would only, if she was only interested in his land and his property, like, she would have agreed to marry him the first time he asked. Whereas the fact that it was that moment when he really admitted to her that he admired who she was as a person, like, he fully saw who she was as a person and admitted that that's who he actually liked. He fully saw her for who she was and really admitted that that's what he was attracted to. Like, that's the moment that she started to feel love for him. I think that was symbolic. Like, she was kind of playing it off like it was kind of silly, but I think in reality, like, that was the moment that things started to shift between the two of them. Because the feminine longs to be seen. She longs to be witnessed by the masculine and loved and accepted for who she truly is. Like, she wants the masculine to witness her and to love all of her, and not just her surface beauty, but like who she is as a person. Like, that's what the feminine longs for. And so the minute that Mr. Darcy started really showing her that he truly loved who she really was, that was the moment she started to really open and feel safer with him. And then I really love when Lizzy basically tells her father, Mr. Darcy has gone to Lizzy's father to ask for her hand, and the father, who clearly favors Lizzy. The relationship between the mother and the father, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, is a complex one, and I'm not going to dive into that whole thing because the mother is really kind of crazy. The father is a little bit too passive. He's a grounded, loving father. He absolutely is, but he is a little bit too passive. The mother is like nuts, and really she was so frustrating to me, and I'm not going to dive into her character too much because this is probably already long enough as it is, but I found so frustrating because she was often the reason why people didn't want to marry her daughters, even though she was desperately trying to get her daughters married off. So like that kind of, I found her very frustrating. But the father in general, Mr. Bennett, was a very loving dad, and I love the loving relationship he had with his girls, especially Lizzy. But I will admit, for their marriage, he was a bit too passive and she was way too aggressive. Their marriage was a complex one. I love the conversation that Lizzy has with her dad when her dad's basically like, you know, you're gonna marry Mr. Darcy, like, I thought you hated him. And he wants to make sure that his daughter is actually going into this decision of getting married, like, with her eyes wide open. He wants to make sure that she's making a smart decision and she's not just doing this because she thinks she needs to, because, you know, she wants safety and security. Like, he wants his daughter to be truly happy. You know, she explains that she's been falling in love with him and that he is so honorable and she trusts him. And it's interesting how, you know, the father makes a comment about he doesn't want her to suffer a life of not being able to respect her partner, essentially. Honestly, that is really a question that I think more women need to ask themselves when they're actually considering the man that they're gonna marry and have a family with. Can I respect him? It's a really important question you have to ask yourself as a woman. When you're choosing a partner, you need to ask yourself, can I respect this man? The masculine desires respect above everything. Does that mean that in the course of a lifetime together in a relationship that you are always 100% gonna respect everything he does? Probably not. We're all human. We all have our ups and downs. There's gonna be times when he may do things that you're like, I don't respect him in this moment. But like, overall, as a person, can you respect this man? If the answer is no, he's not the man for you. Maybe you may just not be able to respect the man that he is, and that's fine. You just aren't in alignment. It may be that he is just not a respectable man, in which case he needs to do that work on himself, on his own, and actually become a man that, you know, someone can respect. I would say usually a man in that situation probably doesn't have a lot of self-respect, so that's on him to work through. But regardless, it's not fair to either person to get into a relationship or a partnership of any kind with somebody if you don't respect them. So I love that that is the focus of what this conversation, this father-daughter conversation is. The father's basically like, I don't want you to end up in a relationship with a man you can't respect. And then when Lizzy basically, you know, tells her father how much she admires Mr. Darcy and what a wonderful man he is, and I love that the father's basically like, well, if he is that wonderful, then he truly deserves you. And a father seeing and witnessing a daughter's worth is so important. Like, that father-daughter dynamic of really, the father really teaching the daughter to own her worth is so important, which is probably the reason why Lizzy has been so comfortable owning her worth and standing up for herself throughout the entire movie is because her father has ingrained that in her. And it's so important for fathers to do that. Like, that role between the father and the father really teaching the daughter to own her worth is crucial. And unfortunately, we don't have enough of that in our society, where we don't have young girls who are being told by their fathers that they are worthy, that they should be showing up and expecting a man to treat them with respect. Fortunately, we don't have enough fathers who are teaching their daughters to own their standards, to own their worth, and to not tolerate a man who will not actually treat them like they're worthy. And oh, we need more of that. And I really love that scene of Mr. Bennett basically, you know, acknowledging to his daughter, like, hey, you're worthy, and I want to make sure that you are choosing a man for the right reasons and that he is worthy of you. I love that, and I love their dynamic. There's so many other storylines in this movie we could go through that, you know, I would take forever, but I really wanted to focus on the Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet relationship, because that really is what this whole storyline is about. I love them, their masculine feminine dynamics. Love the ego death that Mr. Darcy goes through. I love the light and the dark feminine, especially her dark feminine of Lizzy. Oh, it's so beautiful, and I highly recommend you guys check this out if you haven't seen it. After you watch this video, I highly recommend that you watch this mini-series. See if you can pick up on some of the things that I mentioned. Honestly, it's great. I'm really glad that I watched it, and I'm really, really glad that it was requested. If you have any comments on, you know, this video or any other film requests, let me know. Leave a comment in the comment section below. I love to hear from you, and I love your suggestions. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a big thumbs up, and be sure you subscribe to my channel. If you're a woman who'd like to connect to her feminine energy, I have online courses. Details are in the description box below, along with links to all my social media accounts. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you join me next time.